Lesson 4, Converting Fractions to Decimals and Percentages. This lesson is broken up into two parts. In part 1, we're going to use proportions to convert fractions and percentages to decimals. And we can use proportions because we'll be working with factors of 100. In part 2, 8 and 6 are not factors of 100, so we're going to use long division to solve these problems. We'll do one example from part 1, and part 2 has a comparison sequence, so we'll take a look at what that sequence looks like in part 2. Here's our example from part 1. We have 41/50ths, and we're going to convert it to a percentage and to a decimal using proportions. We can do that because this is a factor of 100. So write blank over 100, multiply by 2, multiply by 2. 41 times 2 is 82. 50 times 2 is 100. That makes it easy to find our percentage. So we have 82%. Move the decimal 2 places to the left, and we have 0.82 or 82 hundredths. Now let's look at part 2, where we use division instead of proportions. This example is already worked out, and we had to use division instead of proportions because 8 is not a factor of 100. So 1/8 is also read as 1 divided by 8, and we solved this by writing 1 divided by 8. The answer that we came up with is 0.125 or 125 thousandths. Now let's convert it to a percentage. Move the decimal point over 2 spaces, and our answer is 12.5%, which can also be read as 12 5/10 of a percent. Now the most important problems in part 2 are on the right side because it contains a comparison sequence. Let's take a look. Notice that we have the same fraction written 3 times. 3/6, 3/6, and 3/6. And we're going to solve them in 3 different ways. Let's start with the first box. We're going to use division, and we need to use division because 6 is not a factor of 100. So let's write down 3 divided by 6. Here's 3 divided by 6. And I know I'm going to need a decimal and some trailing zeros, so let me write that down. And before you start dividing, take that decimal point and write it straight up. Let's cover up. 3 divided by 6, we can't do that. Here's 30 divided by 6. That gives me 5. 5 times 6 is 30. Subtract. And we're done with this problem. Now let's convert it to a percentage. Here's 5/10, and I need to move the decimal point over 2 places. To make it easier, add a trailing 0, 1, 2, and that'll give me 50%. Let's go on to the next example. Here it says, simplify first, then use division. So in the fraction 3/6, we can simplify it by dividing by 3 in the numerator and denominator. 3 is the GCF. Divide by 3, divide by 3, and that gives us 1/2. And 1/2 can be read as 1 divided by 2. So let's write down 1 divided by 2. I know I'm going to need a decimal and a trailing 0, so let me write it down. And before we start dividing, take that decimal point, go straight up, and write it down so you don't forget it. Let's divide. 1 divided by 2 doesn't work. Slide over again. Now we have 10 divided by 2. That gives us 5. 5 times 2 is 10. Subtract. And we're done with this problem. Let's convert it to a percentage. Again, we need to move the decimal point 2 places over. So add a trailing 0 to help out. 1, 2, and that'll give us 50%. And if you notice, We got the same answer both with the percentages and with the decimals. Last example. Here it says, simplify first, then use a proportion. But I thought we couldn't use a proportion because 6 is not a factor of 100. So let's see what's going on with this problem. Let's go ahead and simplify. We can divide the numerator and denominator by 3. Divide by 3, divide by 3, and that gives us 1/2. And it says to use a proportion, and what do you know? 2 is now a factor of 100, so we can use a proportion to solve this problem. I'll write down blank over 100. How do you go from 2 to 100? We multiply by 50. Multiply by 50 in the numerator as well. 1 times 50 is 50. 2 times 50 is 100. It's already there. And our answer is 50 hundredths. Now we can convert it to a percentage. 50 hundredths means 50 per 100, which means 50%. And notice that we got the same answer for the percentages every single time. And this is why the comparison sequence was in there and why it was so important. It showed us 3 different ways of solving the same problem, and some ways were easier than others. For example, in the last box, I didn't have to use any long division, and I solved it using a proportion, which was easy to do. And that's the power of fluency. When students are fluent with their multiplication facts, when they're fluent with fractions, and they're fluent with proportions, it opens up choices. And now students have the power to choose whatever method works best.